Miss Hartwell! Miss Hartwell! You have to help us! 10-year-old Jasper Coleman came running through the dusty streets of Pine Ridge, Colorado territory, his face streaked with tears and his small fists clutching a crumpled wanted poster. It was October 15, 1882, and what this frightened boy was about to tell traveling newspaper editor Eleanor Hartwell would lead her into the most dangerous investigation of her career, one that would force her to choose between her journalistic integrity and her own survival. Eleanor looked up from her portable printing press, which she had set up in the back room of Brennan's General Store like she did in every frontier town she visited. At 28, Eleanor Hartwell had been publishing the Frontier Herald for 3 years, traveling from settlement to settlement in her modified wagon, gathering local news stories and printing weekly editions that she sold for 5 cents each. She was one of only a handful of female journalists working the frontier, and she had learned to be both fearless in pursuing stories and careful about the enemies she made. "Slow down, Jasper," Eleanor said gently, wiping the boy's tears with her handkerchief. She had arrived in Pine Ridge 5 days earlier and had already met most of the town's 147 residents, including Jasper Coleman, whose father ran the local blacksmith shop. The boy was known for his honesty and his tendency to notice things that adults missed. "Tell me what's wrong. It's about the missing people," Jasper whispered, glancing nervously toward the store's front windows as if afraid someone might be watching. "Pa says I shouldn't talk about it, but they're not just missing, Miss Hartwell. Something terrible happened to them, and everyone's too scared to say anything." The 10-year-old's voice carried a weight of knowledge that no child should have to bear. Eleanor set down her composing stick and gave Jasper her full attention. In her 3 years of frontier journalism, she had learned that children often saw things more clearly than adults, especially when those adults had reasons to look the other way. "Who's missing, Jasper? Tell me everything you know." "The Donnelly family," Jasper said, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "They had that little ranch up in Pine Valley, about 8 miles north of here. Old man Donnelly owed money to the bank, but he was working hard to pay it back. Then one morning, their house was empty. All their clothes were still there, breakfast was still on the table, but the whole family was gone." Jasper paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "That was 6 weeks ago, and nobody's seen them since." Eleanor felt the familiar tingle of excitement that came with the scent of a real story. Mysterious disappearances were exactly the kind of human interest pieces that her readers craved, but they were also the kind of stories that could get a traveling journalist into serious trouble if the wrong people were involved. "Has anyone searched for them? What does the sheriff say?" Jasper's expression darkened. "Sheriff Blackwood says they probably just packed up and left in the middle of the night to avoid their debts. But Miss Hartwell, I was up there hunting rabbits 2 days after they disappeared, and I found something." The boy reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished silver locket. This was buried under some loose dirt behind their barn. "It belonged to Mrs. Donnelly. I seen her wearing it at church every Sunday." Eleanor took the locket and examined it carefully. It was a delicate piece, clearly valuable enough that no family would abandon it willingly, especially not one facing financial hardship. The fact that it was buried rather than simply dropped suggested something far more sinister than a midnight departure to avoid creditors. "Jasper, this is very important. Have you told anyone else about finding this?" "No, ma'am," Jasper replied quickly. "Pa told me to stay away from the Donnelly place, and Sheriff Blackwood made it real clear that anyone asking too many questions about missing people would be seen as troublemakers." The boy's eyes filled with fear as he continued. "But Miss Hartwell, there's more missing families. The Hendersons disappeared 3 months ago. The Kowalskis vanished in July, and last week the Pattersons' ranch was found empty too. 4 families disappearing over the span of 4 months was not a coincidence, especially in a territory where people didn't simply vanish without leaving some trace of their destination." She carefully placed the locket in her notebook and looked seriously at young Jasper. "I need you to promise me something. Don't tell anyone else about this conversation, and don't go back to any of those empty ranches. Can you do that for me?" What Eleanor discovered over the next 3 days would shake her faith in frontier justice and force her to confront the reality that some stories came with life-threatening consequences. Her investigation began with a careful review of the Pine Ridge land records, which she examined under the pretense of writing a feature story about the town's growth and development. What she found was a disturbing pattern of recent property transfers that all led back to the same buyer, Ezra Blackwood, the brother of Sheriff Blackwood and the owner of the largest ranch in 3 counties. Each of the missing families had owned small but valuable pieces of property that bordered Blackwood's massive holdings. Each had been struggling with debts to the Pine Ridge Bank, which was owned by a consortium of investors that included Ezra Blackwood himself, and each property had been quietly transferred to Blackwood's name within days of the family's disappearances, with the transactions explained as debt settlements for amounts that seemed suspiciously low. Eleanor's second discovery came when she visited the Pine Ridge Bank, under the pretense of writing a story about frontier banking practices. Bank President Horace Whitman, a nervous man in his 50s, seemed genuinely surprised by some of her questions about the property transfers. When Eleanor asked about the Donnelly family's debt settlement, Whitman pulled out their file with a puzzled expression. "That's odd," Whitman muttered, examining the documents. "According to my records, the Donnellys owed us $347, but this settlement shows they owed $1,200, and I don't recall authorizing this transfer." The banker's confusion seemed genuine, but when Eleanor asked to see the other missing family's files, Whitman suddenly became evasive. "I'm sorry, Miss Hartwell, but I can't share confidential banking information with the press." That evening, Eleanor was working late on her article when she heard a soft tapping on the window of her rented room above the general store. Opening the window carefully, she found Whitman standing in the alley below, his face pale with fear in the moonlight. "Miss Hartwell," he whispered urgently, "I need to talk to you, privately. Meet me at the church in 10 minutes, and make sure nobody sees you leave."